Now, in the last episode, we dealt with the problem of visibility, and we looked at things like night vision and thermal vision as a way to kind of overcome this. Now, there are some misconceptions out there when it comes to these things. Namely, around thermal vision and night vision, a lot of people think that it requires a lot of changes to be made to the game. But as we showed it in an earlier episode, I think actually a couple of years ago now at this point, Lumberyard has that built in. And what it is it's not really a question of so much developing the art assets as it is developing or adding the tags to certain things, and then basically giving certain things certain attributes, and then that is how it is displayed in the game. You don't have to go through and paint each individual suit of armor or whatnot to change the way they appear. You're basically changing the way that material would reflect light. It's more of like a shader change rather than changing the actual structure of a character or the way that the various textures are painted. It's just a, almost like a reflection, if you will. So it's not all that difficult to implement. But there are other limitations I would like to talk about with that I didn't get to talk about in that episode, because it kind of goes from the visual scene to the auditory. And there's a problem with first-person perspective games. And by the way, this is not, any kind of, some kind of let's change Star Citizen to over-the-shoulder or a third-person camera, because Star Citizen has always been billed as a first-person game. But one of the things that you have to do when you make a first-person game is you have to make certain allowances when you're playing first-person games. Now, shooters, games like Star Citizen, where you're actually using a firearm, they tend to skirt in an area of first-person gaming where it's not all that bad. You can, we've played these games for years, first-person shooters, and in general, it works very, very well, right? And we can enjoy it. There are certain limitations and there are certain problems, but there are ways to design around that, and the first-person shooter has really been in development for so long. It's been used in so many games that it's generally accepted. We're used to it. But, recently, a number of people were trying to open up different MMOs to, basically my WoW player group. They were all going like, hey, now that we've settled down with progress in retail WoW, they were looking for different things to play, and a suggestion came up of a new MMO that was basically medieval melee combat, but played in the first-person perspective, and I resoundingly shot that down. I was like, those games are the worst. And they are. They're horrible. In first person, shooting with guns, you're kind of shooting from a stable platform. It's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad. But, there are ways to kind of overcome that. But the problem is that when you move into like melee weapons and you move into swords and shields, in a game like Star Citizen, your perspective shifts from, looking down the sights to the gun moving off to the side as you're kind of moving around. But if you can imagine, if I was, swinging a sword or moving around in a three-dimensional space like I am when I'm, say, out in, zero gravity, this is kind of similar to swinging a shield, or swinging a sword rather, or raising a shield and all of that. It becomes very disorienting in first-person melee combat games, and that's why whenever someone suggests a game like that, I'm immediately like, no, absolutely not. And that's even why a lot of survival games, I will not play them if they are first-person sword and shield and there's no third-person view. I will actually stay away from them. Now, I think that when you're talking about first-person shooters, though, there are some issues. There are still some problems, and one of those problems is the problem of perspective. That first-person perspective, like if you're watching this video on the same monitor that you play your games on, or chances are, like a lot of people, you're watching it on your second monitor that you use to, read chat or watch Discord while you're playing a game. You realize that if you're looking at that monitor that you play on right now, and you think of your entire field of view and where you can see, within the room that you're in, or maybe you're riding on the bus watching this on your phone, but that viewing space is actually quite small compared to your entire field of vision, and trying to compress all those kind of inputs into that very limited space. In a shooter, it can be somewhat problematic. Now, we've dealt with this before when we've talked about cockpit views and the limitations and kind of the over-design in a lot of the ships in Star Citizen in terms of cockpit, and the way that it obstructs and it becomes an oppressive presence in your gameplay. But in shooters, you don't really have a cockpit. You have the rifle sticking up in the middle, and then you have your HUD. And it's fairly good, but there is kind of one dimension where first-person shooters are actually, despite them being visually somewhat realistic, are overall unrealistic compared to third-person perspective. And the third-person perspective, I think, better approximates the total sensory input that you would realistically have in that situation. You may not be able to see all around you at 180 or more degrees, but you can hear and you can perceive things at the very fringes of your eyesight. If you ever think about any time you've been at work or something like that, and maybe something just brushed past your head, but you saw it coming out of the corner of your eye really quick, you ducked so you didn't get hurt. Third-person perspective, I think, better approximates that. Now, of course, we can't really just say, okay, let's make Star Citizen third person. That wouldn't work. That's not the way the universe was built. It's not the way the universe was created. But I think we can look to areas like audio design. And we can maybe start to look at maybe doing, I don't want to say a better job, but here's a good example of, first-person melee games. It's like you're permanently stuck bouncing down these hallways. But to get back on track, when we think of audio design, especially in a lot of games, we try to create these kind of like sound vistas, or these aural, AURAL, experiences. I gotta be very careful with that. I totally threw myself off there, but we got to create these kind of soundscapes that best, kind of immerse us in the environment. It can be background noises, it can be a little bit of ominous music, something like that, and it makes for a very good experience. But I think that with the limitations of the first-person perspective and the potential for, a lot of these games that are shooters like this don't really face players with the long-term permanent cost. Even a game like Tarkov or Scum or something like that, it's round to round to round. You're not really, you don't have to face the huge personal costs that you could face in Star Citizen. Scum does a fairly good job of creating a system where you can hear people coming up on you. But I think that in Star Citizen, we should look to something like that, like the survival game Scum. And there's other games out there as well that people can name that are examples of this. But we can do a better job of, maybe dialing down the magnitude of the environmental sounds, and maybe dialing up the incidental sounds that players may create or NPCs may create when they're walking through an environment. If you think about when you're going into a bunker, you can hear the guys talking in the distance even before you can see them. Localizing them by the sounds of their voice, given the complex environment, is understandable that it's a little bit difficult. But I think that we can do a better job in terms of the sound design in certain areas so that players, to give a very specific example, if you've ever been to SPK, Korea, and you've been, knocking down your crime stat, in that tense moment when you're waiting for those crime stats and those, criminal behaviors to disappear, you become very aware of every sound in the station, every knock on the pipe, every potential sound of an intruder, and you're constantly looking around you, and it builds for a very tense situation. But I think that it would be better to kind of dial those things down a little bit and maybe focus more on making it so that a player who maybe is, clumping in on a heavy suit of armor is much more present, so that you're much more aware that, oh, okay, someone just came in through the door. I should be able to hear that. Or maybe if a player is being very, very careful in the future, maybe there's a way to sneak into SPK that another player wouldn't hear. Maybe there's an airlock through the vents that you can use to kind of come into the station that way. And different suits or different shoes, different speeds of movement that you can use to really draw back on how much you're broadcasting your position to other players. I think that on the one hand, it gives players better environmental awareness, which I would say the first person perspective kind of hampers, but it also adds a layer of skilled gameplay and skilled calculation where players can kind of go like, oh, I'm going to make certain sacrifices on armor, but I'm going to gain, a much more stealthier character innately, and then add that technique and skill. I think that really we're kind of playing into, I think, a very good and rewarding area that way. I mean, the sound design in Star Citizen is, pardon the pun, stellar. It's great. It's fantastic. And, when I was naming that example of SPK, I would say that is outstanding in terms of driving up the tension of a situation. But I think that within that realm, there's an area for skilled gameplay where we can allow players to kind of express their personal skill and their personal knowledge of the game systems. And it would be something that I think all too often is overlooked. And certainly when we're talking about things like thermal vision or night vision, we have to be careful how we implement these things because it could dampen player skill. I still think that they're necessary, but I think that there should be ways around that maybe players can, seek out certain very specific suits of armor or, space suits, whatever you want to call them. I guess I'm using like kind of sword and board terminology here, that maybe dampen a thermal signature or maybe lessen your visual signature, not full on like Predator armor where you become invisible, but maybe something not too dissimilar, I think that if we kind of look at these areas, I think that we can find a really rich area to mine for, rewarding expressions of player skill and player competence with the game systems. And at the same time, maybe dampening some of the, the not so great systems, or some of the limitations of the first person perspective, which, I mean, are really there when you think about it. Sometimes you don't really notice it because the games that you play, especially when they're shooters, are, they don't really show those weaknesses all that well. Whereas, like a melee combat game in the first person perspective shows it all too well and shows those limitations. It's kind of like when people do suggest those games, I just like, no, those games are terrible, especially when they're melee. Whether it's a certain helmet that increases your chance of, detecting footfalls in the distance or something else. I would just like to see this area become, or, playing with this become an expression of player skill rather than just an absolute.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.